I mean, this is really, you know, it's social science. It's not science in a way, but I think there are some really useful things that could come from that, where we can learn from one another to do that kind of campaigning much more effectively in individual countries. So, sorry, Holly, you had some comments.
No, I thought I'd quickly answer some of the questions that were in the chat, because Moritz, I hope I said your name correctly, mentioned about engagement with cities versus rural areas in the whole of Africa, and I didn't mention specifically, but this is specifically a network for researchers at the moment. So it's mainly linked to people who are doing active research, or are planning to do research, or are currently involved in some sort of academic or NGO lab. We do have other delegates or members in who are interested in research and how that research is going to factor into, for example, governments or public awareness campaigns or school education. But it is mainly driven by sharing, you know, what research we're doing, so we're not duplicating the same things, and we're asking similar questions or novel questions. So I think it's mainly in the cities. Yeah. And then the question about the schools, I can't specifically say much about. That was a long time ago. So from South Africa point of view, maybe Umberto will be able to say more about what they're teaching at schools, because I cannot remember what I got taught at school. But I have a feeling they do teach a lot of waste management and plastic pollution issues in South Africa specifically, and I probably will not say anything else about other African countries, as I'm just not aware of what they're doing there.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of feedback from the rest of the world. The situation is really variable across the countries. We have some countries in which there is no education at all. Some other countries that would like to start education, but they're missing data and they're missing capacity to train the teachers to speak in the right way about marine pollution and especially plastics and waste. And we approach this in two different ways. We developed the education packs for the schools, just for the teachers and the school classes, but also we adapted it, creating some community packs, and the community packs were aimed to the NGOs, so we could do also the informal activities. And in countries like Belize, we've seen that the NGOs are way more active. So there is something in the school, but the general feeling is that is not completely fully developed. So there is the need for easy to digest information about waste and about plastics to reach the young generations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I mean, I think I'm trying to catch up with the chat, but Andy Smith made a really important point, which is I know one that I've discussed a number of times with Holly, about the fact that there has been a lot of pressure over the last couple of years to improve the quality of microplastic publications, and a lot of that I think resulted from recommendations from Kuhlman's group and others about the need for explicit identification of types of microplastics in order to validate a study as being useful in any way or believable in any way. And I have some personal views on that, which I don't necessarily need to share too much. But I think one of the negative aspects of that drive has been that a lot of potentially very valuable information is not getting published because many local studies perhaps can't reach that level of analysis. but have still made really useful empirical observations that could contribute, for instance, into the grey literature of the Singapore database content, for instance. And I am worried that as a community, we are losing a lot of that information, and we're discouraging people from doing that kind of research because you know, a number of groups who maybe have access to the best equipment are basically discouraging that kind of research as a valid way forward. And I think that is potentially a problem that needs to be addressed in the international community. And one way of addressing it, of course, is to make high-level equipment available to far more researchers through collaborations in country or in region centres of excellence and so forth. And I hope that might, you know, that might arise in the coming years. But at the moment, it's very much done on an ad hoc basis. And there is, from my perspective, it's a kind of uncomfortable colonialization of microplastic science, which is saying that unless you do it our way, it's not worth doing. Yeah, as I said, that really worries me conceptually, because I think we're going to be missing a vast amount of really valuable information. And if we look back, you know, all the microplastic research which is going on now is based on initial findings that were published 5 to 10 years ago, when very little of that type of analysis was done. But nobody now is saying that, you know, that research was irrelevant or had no value because it didn't meet this particular, you know, threshold of detail. Let's call it detail in its analytical approaches. So yeah, that's something I think we, as a community, we really need to guard against. So sorry, Holly.
I just wanted to say something about this idea of polymer identification and the techniques that are necessary for identifying different polymers. And something that we discussed in the paper that we published, and also amongst the network members and in meetings, is the fact that a lot of the equipment that is designed to do these, you know, the polymer identification is not made in Africa. It's not made for the African environment. The humidity, the constant outages of electricity, a lot of the maintenance. I mean, you know, I've worked with a machine that broke down so often, but luckily I was in the UK, so the technician, you know, popped over, you know, every few weeks and fixed it, and that's not possible in a lot of the African countries. And I think when we make these recommendations of harmonization and what needs to be put in monitoring plans, we've got to think about the fact that these pieces of equipment aren't designed in Africa. So maybe having equipment that is designed in Africa for the African scenario is something that we need to look into on a way forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you, in terms of developing appropriate infrastructure, Umberto or Andy maybe can comment on this. How have you sought to provide that in-country infrastructure for the labs that you've been setting up under the Clipman program?
Good question. It has been a huge challenge, and actually Andy has been heavily involved in shipping things around. That is one of the reasons why I said at the end of my presentation that a presence in country, even during the remote delivery, is still useful, because having somebody that is in country and is able to clear customs or being able to go to the deposit and take a piece of equipment and bring into the university. It's way easier to do rather than following everything from abroad. The approach we had was trying to buy everything that was available in country from country. So finding local local companies that will sell this, but everything that could not be bought in country, we were buying it in the UK and then shipping it. And obviously that comes with a lot of challenges for logistics and organizations, and also costs, because the costs are spiraling quite high. However, we noticed that if we didn't do it, it would have been even more complicated for people in the country to even start thinking about setting up a lab like that one. So it's a huge effort, but it's very valuable effort, we think.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there would be benefit in creating some kind of guide to setting up a functional microplastics lab or functional plastic assessment lab? Do you have such a guide, such a document, and is that something that could be shared more widely for others interested in doing similar things?
We do not have anything like that. We are actually working now. It's the first time we are setting this remotely, so we are trying ourselves. And Adil, that I think is on the call, has been heavily involved with me in speaking with all the officers in the agencies that received the lab to be able to set everything up. And we're using everything. We're using calls. Now we are going to have a WhatsApp group in which they can just send us a picture of a machine and tell us, what do we do with this? How do we set this up? So it's very trial and error at the moment. But yeah, I think that some guidelines will be very useful. It's something that we might think developing, and again will be very useful, like the videos, to leave as a legacy in the country. So the project has a very long-term impact rather than having results just while the program is on. So it will be a very valuable deliverable, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a really useful outcome from this meeting and this conversation perhaps would be simply to share some of these resources that exist. For instance, the training videos that various different people have prepared and produced, because while they might have, you know, local contextual differences that need to be considered and addressed, the core content of many of those training videos will be relevant in any lab, in any environment. And I think if we can do more to share that information around rather than duplicating it, that will be really, really useful. And of course, there is also the language issue. So, yeah, you know, being from Britain, I have this natural tendency to assume, quite ridiculously and arrogantly, that everybody understands English very well. And of course, we're all sitting here discussing in English, you know, what we might do. But there is obviously a need to be much more aware of local conditions and the possible need to communicate in different ways. So I think in that sense, videos are great because they're very visual, even if the language doesn't always get through. And I mean, we have a little bit use subtitling in multiple languages in some of our material, and I guess you might have done too.
Yeah, we did the same.
Yeah, so that is also a way forward where perhaps somebody can quite easily edit and adapt a resource without completely reproducing it, but can simply re-subtitle it in a new language, for instance, to make it more accessible to a particular community.
And I think if I can just add a little thing, that creating the network is very important, because if people get stuck at the first problem, it's very difficult to recreate momentum. So it's very important to have that constant feedback from experts, not only people that started building the lab, but also the international community, to be able to solve the problems. Because otherwise, if you cut the connections and there is no communication, it's the easiest way in which the lab that you have just built is not going to be used. So creating events like this one are very important for that one. Just creating those connections and being able to give support to anybody that needs it.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments that they'd like to add to this conversation? I think there's been some good sharing of various bits of information and resources going on in the chat in the meantime, and that's great to see. And I see the next generation of interested receivers of our education perhaps has just been. So Holly, yes.
I just wanted to say one thing that I tried to allude on in the talk. Often we see what we've done really well and who's talking, and I know I'm quite vocal, so it's also about who's not coming to the meetings, who's not joining the network or writing papers on microplastics or things like that, and why, and trying to find ways to engage with them in different levels, because there is probably a reason why they, maybe they don't feel comfortable or things. And it was something that we struggled with when we were trying to get people to talk for each month. Initially we would reach out to people, and then we wanted our network members to come to us and say, I want to give a talk, I want to share my knowledge, and no one wanted to do that. And there was a reason that they didn't feel comfortable. So yeah, it's just something that we have constantly been discussing, and maybe it's useful for other people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a really interesting observation.
Just sorry, Andrew, can I just about Holly questions? Actually, I think Hannah have done a very good job for us for this symposium. She asked us to pre-record our talk. I think maybe it's a way for people not to feeling nervous to need to talk on the spot. So maybe pre-record is a good way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is really good, and it also perhaps for people who are a little less confident to present in English, it gives them an opportunity to maybe review their contributions and edit their contributions and so forth. So I think it is a very useful way to share information, and I hope, well, many of the talks from, obviously this symposium has been recorded, so I hope that it will be shared. I think, Hannah, you were planning to put it on the MyMIP YouTube channel, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Hopefully sometime next week the videos will be on there, and I'm just about to post the link to the MyMIP website in the chat again and on the whiteboard. Hopefully you can all see that as well. Yeah.
So hopefully that is a way that some of the thoughts, ideas, and content from this symposium can be shared more widely going forward. So it might be worth just spending a few moments thinking about how we might move towards consistent practice and unification of methods, and I know this is something that Professor Isobe has been very, very keen to promote, and that we will be trying to move forward with in a wider Southeast Asian context. And obviously there are quite a few sets of guidelines by now available from various international organizations. But I don't know how we move forward to the next step in terms of using those guidelines, or deciding whose guidelines we're going to use, or deciding why we think the guidelines aren't quite correct for a particular local context, and therefore, you know, doing it somehow differently. And it's also a kind of bottleneck going forward. There is a desire to have uniform data that can be compared across countries and across regions. But obviously, whenever you unify practice, there is always the danger that you all unify on something that might be the lowest common denominator, or it might be deficient in some way to pick up particular important details or trends in local conditions. So I don't know what anybody thinks about that in terms of, you know, the need to do that as a way forward, compared with potential risks of unifying and perhaps simplifying too soon. Okay, somebody, yeah, Atsuhiko, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I have a small comment. Probably Andrew, you know, deeply understand what I want to say. So harmonization and standardization is a very important keyword to make monitoring of ocean plastic and to establish the monitoring network. And the baseline of that network or monitoring is to share the same guideline. And we already have guidelines for the microplastics and ocean plastics, but mostly guideline is adapted for the mid-latitude countries. So in the Southeast Asian country or South Asian country need so guidelines specified for their country. For example, we have mangrove areas, we have coral reef, we have big river mouths. So in this case, we need the guideline of the microplastic monitoring specified for that areas. That is a new challenge to establish a new guideline, and that is new challenge for the Asian or Southeast Asian researchers for the ocean plastic monitoring. Yes, thank you.
So there is a real need for Southeast Asian countries themselves and experts from those countries to get together to establish more specific, detailed guidelines within the general guidelines for those particular environments, and to ensure that they're working for those particular localized environments.
Yes, and in addition, that guideline can be used in other countries in the subtropical and tropical areas, such as African countries or mid-American nations. So we have so many availability of that guideline. So we have to. So Southeast Asian countries or Asian countries researchers should be the top of front runner to make such kind of the guidelines. I hope so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think there could be a really interesting opportunity there, Holly, perhaps for the African network, because I think it seems to me that there are quite a lot of projects running in Southeast Asia, because it's regarded as the global hotspot, perhaps. You know, quite a few countries have initiatives linking with Southeast Asian countries to do this kind of study, and indeed we have a new project with Atsuhiko just starting. But I think if we can develop some of those guidelines, there may be a really good opportunity for the you know to review them in an African context and ask, are they fit for purpose in those environments, and to perhaps exchange and join some initiatives to create, when those guidelines are created, to test them out in other environments and find out to what extent they're fit for purpose and where the problems might arrive. Okay, so there's a couple. Una.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon. I thought I would jump in on that question about guidelines because I've been working on that topic for a number of years. The thing about guidelines is that there's two types. There's the types that the scientists worry about, and there's the types that the policymakers worry about. And we're a little bit stuck in between confusion in language, because people talk about guidelines, but they talk about different things. And what you have to be fully aware of is that Indonesia has already adopted its own guidelines for method-to-guide methodology and sampling methodologies. So Malaysia is developing its own. And there's similar work that's being done throughout Southeast Asia. COPSI has a working group on marine litter that has a project on the development of guidelines, regional guidelines, that's now soon coming back to the policymakers for adoption. And there's a similar parallel project under the ASEAN. So we certainly, we do have a lot of paper on guidelines. And then what you end up seeing is that at the level of projects, well, you have to make do with what you have, right? So you have the guidelines, you glance at them, you have little time, and you have whatever you have. So then you have data that comes out. And we get back to square one. So I'm sort of two minds about all of this discussion on standardization, because on the one hand, we do need minimum comparability to be able to integrate data. But on the other hand, we also need to be able to acknowledge the difficulties and the realities of sampling. And so find ways towards comparability rather than seeking absolutely for, harmonization. I don't think that full harmonization is possible. The richest countries have tried and failed. You look at the discussion at OSPA, and that's not what they're doing. They're actually agreeing on indicators. So, yeah, just I think discussions to continue within scientists and to maybe push forward on how can we convert. And so when you look at two trawls of different sizes of plastic, whether macro or micro and whichever sizes, then the opening of the trawls, the depths at which the way the gear are operated will actually determine how comparable the data is. So, and that's where they are at the moment. They've reduced in the OSPA context, they've had to make systematic in order to be able to compare, they're comparing the catchability and they're looking at statistically what's the likelihood of catching certain profile of plastic material. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's the trial of error that they've gone through that has led them to that very pragmatic approach. And that would be quite useful to become a little bit more pragmatic also in the context of Southeast Asia, and acknowledge that we need to meet somewhere between the reality and the barriers that are encountered in the context of sampling and the desirability at policy level and the kind of considerations that the policymakers have when they agree on specific guidelines. So sorry, I thought I would jump in on there.
Yeah, okay.
I don't see any solutions, but
yeah, I think it's a really useful contribution and a really useful reminder that, of course, at the end of the day, we are all doing the best we can with what we have, but perhaps when we are considering setting up new initiatives and talking about how we might set up in-country capability or support in-country capability, there are definitely opportunities at that point to try and create some kind of uniformity of practice, perhaps. So it's true that it isn't always going to be achievable, and ultimately it might not be desirable, because the danger is always we all end up measuring the wrong thing. We all measure it very well and very uniformly, but if it turns out to be the wrong thing that we're measuring, then you know that uniformity and that effort is not necessarily going to provide the data stream that's required for future future understanding and future policy. So
I'm not suggesting that comparability, that what you, I mean, I agree with obviously with the objective of and the need for comparability in data, and so some level of standardization where possible. I think that the discussion the discussion would benefit from being narrowed down to what it means to standardize and what would need standardization and what can be standardized, because then maybe it would become more feasible, because at the moment it's sort of a very big lump of a discussion and different people talk about it, but in fact they talk about something completely different, and that prevents from getting to a solution. That was more my point. Certainly it's worthwhile, necessary, and we should all try.
Yeah, and it actually reminds me of a lecture I heard a few months ago about ISO standards, and the fact that, you know, despite the fact that ISO is an internationally recognized body, they have loads of committees in loads of different areas who are all discussing standardization issues. And even within ISO, I think they have 4 different committees discussing microplastics, and they can't even agree what the definition of a microplastic is, because all 4 committees all have different opinions, and they won't come together and decide. And I guess that kind of highlights the problem that you always have when you start to discuss these kind of international standardization things. I guess OSPAR has a very long history, of course, of trying to do this for lots of different areas of measurement and science. So it's perhaps an interesting lesson for us to take away for that. Okay, I think you have a comment, Umberto.
Yeah, just for like a very practical solution that we would like to take on this. We discussed with you, Andrew, about developing a system to assess the comparability of the data from the different labs. So doing an exercise in which we send reference material. So even if the methodology is different, even if the sampling is different, at least we know that the data coming out from the lab are comparable. So if you're using the same methodology, the numbers make sense with each other. And this is something that we are developing on OCPP, not only for the labs that we developed during CLIP, but we would like to include any other lab that is working with Nile Red, to be sure that if I count 2 particles are the same 2 particles that would have been counted anywhere else, or if there is a lab that for problems of contamination, they always count 4 instead of 2, at least it's something that is known and we can apply some form of correction to it. So as a practical way forward to standardization, it at least be sure that the numbers make sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, obviously that's something we've been discussing internally, and I think there is a good opportunity here, because the Malaysian network is using similar methodology to the methodology we're using at UEA, similar to the methodology that's being used at CFAS and now in many of the in-country facilities that have been set up through CFAS. So I think there's a very good opportunity there to do some kind of inter-lab comparison, and it's just a matter of getting that set up in an appropriate way, and I hope there will be will to do that within the labs that are involved in the new STAN project. I hope so, at least. Okay, I'm aware that we have now kind of reached the end of our discussion time, so perhaps it's time for me to hand over back to Hannah, who's been extremely diligently taking notes on our whiteboard. I don't know if everybody can see that because we had some problems sharing it yesterday, but Hannah's been filling in lots of detail about the discussion that's been taking place. So I thank you all for your contributions to that discussion, and hopefully we've captured some of the key points from it that we can then share in some way at the end of this symposium.